Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lobster Tank. I'm Matt.
Fuck lobsters. Whoa! Good to see you, friend. We're joined by someone.
Yes, this is different. Hello, Shawn.
Hey, how's it going?
All right.
We were interested in having a conversation about the idea shape, once again, that we didn't invent, but we just amalgamated into what's called the golden square, the guaranteed right to food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And we've loved your episodes on Library Socialism for your Seriously Wrong podcast. And so we thought this would be a good episode to talk about how to unify these things.
We've mentioned library socialism a number of times in the past couple months, at least, so it's been in the show notes. So today we wanted to talk about library socialism and the golden square and how those ideas complement each other in a vision for a socialist future. So before we talk about the details there, why do we need to be fighting for a socialist world?
If we're defining socialism in contrast to capitalism, capitalism is a structure designed around the holding of capital. Socialism would be a structure designed around the social realm. So the reason that I'd say that socialism is good, or I like socialism, or I want to create a socialist society, is because I think what's wrong with the society is the way that it dehumanizes and degrades people and takes the space between people, which should be a vibrant space where people can learn to know each other, learn together, love each other. And capitalism turns that space into something that's degraded. It's something that can be up for sale. It can be filtered through these bizarre mechanisms of the way that we think about property, hierarchy.
It's a total hellscape. I mean, the term capitalism is designed about a focus and obsession with capital, that profit is everything, that wealth is everything. And socialism itself is about social belonging, social beings, the sociology of trust and compassion and cooperation and reciprocity. And to me, the terms say what they say. Capitalism is about an obsession and orientation towards growth and profit and domination. And socialism, to me, is about social belonging and social togetherness.
I think people who are in favor of the way that things currently are and think of capitalism as a naturalized state of the world, they sort of function with this unconscious assumption that the world is an economy that people just happen to live in. Mm-hmm. But that's not the case. It's the opposite. Capital and the constructs of markets and so on, these are all things that come from the social realm, that come from human creativity. Yep. They're historically developed tools to be used, but we let the tools become our master in a way. And the way I'd compare it to is like our political systems are tools that can be useful and so on. But if your tools get stuck to your hands, even if you're the best carpenter in the world, if you can't drop your hammers, you're going to beat your own children to death. So like what the society does is it turns us into tool-handed monsters who can't hug our own children because we can't put down the tools. And if you look all through the anthropological record, all throughout history, this idea of not being able to put down the tools that are consciously used, whether that's political systems or money or whatever else, it's actually fairly new. So I think socialism also comes from the recognition that everything that we consider to be natural about capitalism, everything about these flows of money and information and goods and stuff, these are all abstracted things from the social realm that are being expressed through the realm of money. Mm-hmm. It's not the opposite. I think socialism should be rooted in that understanding that capitalism is a social construct created by people, and we could just as easily create something else.
And that's, I think, the strength of it, because it has a mythology, a logic to it that works like a myth. So when you complain about capitalism, people look at you like you're complaining about gravity, when actually it's a deeply embedded social construct. And it's like, why are you complaining about this? It's just the way the world is. And I'm like, well, no, it's actually an economist viewpoint that's been constructed by people to dominate others.
Even Adam Smith said that you never see a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. He got it.
It's also an acknowledgement of nature. You know, like there's a great poem by Allen Ginsberg about snow and like this interdependence of nature and nature's ability to reproduce itself and interact in codependence and codetermination is our actual living world. And any attempt to put an economist viewpoint or lens on something is actually part of its myth construction, because it's denial of the actual what the biosphere does and what we do as part of this living organism.
Capitalism, so it's not just a natural outgrowth of, it's not inevitable. Is that trying to convince me of?
It's not part of my armpit hair, that's what I'm going to say.
We do this in a lot of ways. And actually, there's just been recently this Twitter discourse over the last day or so about people arguing about whether or not hierarchies are natural and innate and stuff. And they use the example of the pilot as a hierarchy. We talk about this on our show a lot. But if you think about all the things that we refer to with the word hierarchy, and then you try to look for commonalities amongst them, there's almost none. There's nothing similar about a favorite movie and a president. A president's in charge of things, is in charge of people, and is able to exercise their political will on the world. A favorite movie is a personal expression of preference. So why would we use the word hierarchy for both those things? And so that idea gets stuck in our head, even as revolutionaries, even as anti-capitalists, even as hardcore leftists, is this idea that there's this natural thing out there in the world called hierarchy that human beings participate in because it's the natural state of things. Things are always going to be above or below each other in this abstract sense. But if you unpack that, it's like, what do you mean by above? Because if a hierarchy is any time that something is above something else, is the sky a hierarchy? Is a roof hierarchically above a floor? Obviously not. So this metaphor confuses us so fundamentally. And the reason that I bring this up is it relates to the naturalization of capitalism, because I think there's a lot of really smart people who get, we're naturalizing economic relation, that economic relations are constructs. But then they make the mistake of not taking that all the way to be like, okay, these market relations are constructs, but hierarchical relations are natural. It's both the same thing. And these things are intertwined all through the development of human history. And like you mentioned, Matt, the reality is the developmental trajectory that has led us to this place has always been around difference, not individuals, but differences together, things that are bigger than the sum of their parts, ecosystems, communities, you name it. That's the structure of the world.
The roof doesn't stay up without the walls, without the foundation, without all these other interdependent parts that make the roof. So this idea that higher is somehow better or stronger or natural is absurd. And I think that gets back to Murray Bookchin's acknowledgement of this, is that we're a species that lives alongside nature, and that when you just go outside of your house, it's not like you're in the city because you're still in nature. And our ability to divorce these things into a hierarchy formation is, once again, the great metaphor of Bookchin's idea, is that the domination of each other is manifest in the way that we look at nature as hierarchical, because we have this hierarchical system that we've developed out of really bad mythologies and deployments. We then present and anthropomorphize on the natural world.
You're always in nature. You're in nature in your house right now.
Absolutely. Nature is in every cell of your body. You are nature. We are contingently, not permanently, not innately, not teleologically, but contingently, we are the expression of nature on Earth. We are the fruit on the tree of nature. So the idea that we're going to say that the fruit is above the seed that gives rise to it, it's not ecological. It's not coherent. It's a bizarre idea. But it gets so deep into our thinking that I think even otherwise very, very smart people who have very, very good ethics get misled by it.
And money's the most important because it doesn't grow on trees. So,
well, it's interesting because it doesn't even have to grow on trees. You can just decide that this is a token that can be exchanged for these purposes, et cetera, not exchanged for these purposes. That idea gets in everyone's head, and then it works perfectly.
It's like what David Graeber said, cash and money is just a promise that we make to each other of reciprocity. I can't give you what you want for those donuts, and you don't want my shoes, so here's some cash. And so it's a promise we make to each other when we talk about money. And like we said, it's a shared hallucination. It's digits on a screen, and people want to make a huge rib and roast kind of conversation about it, but it is a shared hallucination that's also a social construction.
Shared hallucinations are massively powerful, though. And I don't think that you're not saying that, but I would just say that to anyone who might take that observation that money is fake and take it to a logical extreme that's actually illogical. Because
it has real material impact, yeah.
Ideas always have material impact. And I'll just give another example of that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, which is racism. It's an awful idea. It's an idea that's so bad, it shaped the last hundreds of years of human society for the worse. Ideas in the material realm, they interact with each other. Ideas are actually rooted in the material, and they have material consequences.
What are the consequences that make it so urgent that socialism is the thing now?
I mean, it depends whether or not you're in favor of involuntary human extinction. If you're in favor of involuntary human extinction, that is people having no choice on whether or not they become extinct, then we don't have to change very much at all. But if you're against people becoming extinct, not by their choice, but because of circumstances, then we really need to change things, because we've got a crisis where It's one big crisis. It's got many different forms. There's a social side to it and there's the ecological side to it. And these two things deeply intertwined, like mentioned before, the way that we think about each other affects the way we look at nature. And we can find anthropological examples that show that in cultures where they don't have these ideas, where they have more sort of fluid ideas of leadership and stuff like that, rather than institutional ones, you also have a feeling towards nature that does not assume that you can just take out all the trees, make some money, and then get out of there.
It's like cutting off your own hand. That's really what it is. It's cutting off your own hand. The idea of that there's a feedback between you and nature is something I think indigenous cultures have understood for hundreds of thousands of years. But for us, we don't notice that we're cutting off our own arm, that there's an equilibrium that the earth lives on. And because of capitalism and the crisis of production and growth-based obsessions, that we're literally cutting off our own arm and saying that the arm somehow doesn't matter.
Well, it's more like now we're actively cutting at the neck.
Yeah.
We're actively cutting our head off. And it is like before we were just making cuts to our arm. We can survive that. Oh, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger.
Surgically removing all of your muscles won't kill you, but it will not make you stronger.
What does the observation and the understanding that the ecological and the social are the same space, what does that mean for how we might get out of this capitalist hellscape and how we might understand what socialism might look like, should look like, and how we might envision it?
One of the things that's often said is you have to deal with the tropes about what socialism is. That it's a homogenization of the world.
Oh, yeah.
And we won't be able to have our hamburgers anymore. And you're taking away all my pleasure. But yet we all look the same exactly. So if I'm 6 feet, you have to hit me down till I'm 5'10".
I've always interpreted as like the future is everyone gets overalls and they get like some dirt on their face and stuff and they have a big wrench. And then when they go to McDonald's, there's just McCheeseburger and there's no fillet of fish, nothing like that, And everyone with their big wrenches and overalls, the real salt of the earth guys.
Took away my freedom! Many of the things that are being said about socialism actually apply much more to capitalism right now. Its ability to create homogenization and scarcity. It's precarity. It's not creating a sustainability in terms of people's lives. It's not even covering basic human necessities. In fact, it's denigrating or undercutting the rights to food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And it's creating huge levels of discord and derangement among people as these inequalities get more grotesque.
I think there's good critiques of socialist states that have existed around the last 100 years or so. But any consistent application of those critiques will find that the problem is bigger than Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
The issue of people not having a say in their own lives, this sort of stuff applies everywhere under capitalism right now, just as much, if not more so in many cases. So I think we can have a consistent critique of different modes of state organization.
Oh, yeah.
But I think we should especially focus on the one that we live under.
Bong Joon-ho, the director, said, when talking to others around the world, I came to the realization that we all live in one country, and that country is called capitalism. And until we actually deal in an international sense that the way capital flows, we have to acknowledge that it doesn't care about borders. And we're told that we have to care about borders when it comes to people. And that the logic of capitalism has to be put against the wall by an international sense of solidarity and a shared understanding of what socialism could look like that builds broad networks of consensus and solidarity.
So what about the vision for socialism and the visions that we've been talking about, that you, Shawn, and Aaron have been talking about in your projects? How do you, Matt and Shawn, both of you see these two developing articulations of both a vision for a socialist realm and a path towards that? How do you see them interacting with each other and or relating to each other?
I see our idea shape of the golden square as nothing we invented. It's things that have been coming up in conversations that we've noticed forever when people talk about basic human rights. And there's been debates about what those fundamental rights are. And for us, we have to have a shared agreement among all of the people on the planet that the rights to food, shelter, healthcare, and education are human rights. They're non-negotiable. They must be decommodified and made available to all as essential human rights. And where I see a connection, and maybe you can add into this, Shawn, is library socialism is the method at which we create those rights, especially when it comes to, let's say, for example, shelter, which isn't just about your house, it's also about clothing. And if we're going to have a library, like you've talked about with Aaron, we're going to need to have a place where we have a post-scarcity society without the massive carbon pressures of consumer capitalism.
That's basically the core idea of what we've started calling library socialism. And it's similarly, like you said, with the golden square. It's not that there's any piece of it that it's like, oh, this is really our little invention. We went in a private room and invented it. Yeah. These are ideas that are floating around that had great degrees of compatibility with each other. And we put it together in a way that we haven't seen other people do. We described it in a different way.
Same as us.
At the same time, I feel like it's something people can generally agree with. It matches people's already existing, you can go on Twitter right now and there's people saying stuff like, why are there homeless people while there are empty houses?
Yeah.
And it's a really, really good question that doesn't have any just answer.
As you said on the SRSLY WRONG podcast, it's not like this is invented out of thin air, because you talk about existing systems that we already have, like libraries, right? That we exchange books. Why can't we exchange tenting equipment? We can have these really good tenting equipment and everyone could borrow it. And so we wouldn't be throwing it away and you would use it and share it. And I think one thing mentioned on your show, which is important, is that library socialism would reduce loneliness among people because it would create more communal opportunities for social engagement and conversation in these vast networks of libraries in your city.
On that note, it gives an insight when you think of, okay, if it's unjust to own a yacht while other people are starving, I think a lot of people probably agree with that. But is it unjust to ride or use a yacht under any circumstances? Well, I think probably not. So if you think of the distinction between under private property, you can have your yacht, you're the little king of your yacht, and people decide what to do with it or not. It's a very lonely situation to be in charge of something. It's a very lonely situation to be a boss. And if you say okay, this yacht or boat, maybe we wouldn't call it a yacht anymore, we're going to share it, we're going to use it appropriately, the amount that we need, we're going to maintain it together, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then you're forced by that construct into social relationships, into navigating questions together and thinking together and coming to conclusions together. And I think that's really what's missing from society. So,
or society of private hoarding.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Eric Ownwright calls it. He calls it the era of privatized hoarding. And the yacht, if it's democratically owned by the community, it might take on new manifestations of usage that we would never imagine because it's democratically orientated in terms of usage. And so it has a new horizon as a physical object.
And we've probably got enough yachts to basically
we're done.
Take care of humanity. We can fix them up and stuff. So this was a thing that really blew my mind. That was this is when library socialism came to exist. I've been thinking a lot about Murray Bookchin's writing on the social and ecological crisis. He advocates for direct democracy, dual power, this sort of stuff as a way of addressing these things at once. And I was thinking about how we have these two intractable, horrible crises that are sort of over us. And I was also thinking about how we have enough for everyone. We just don't give it to people. And so Bookchin in the Ecology of Freedom, he talks about this anthropological concept of usufructian property relations within hunter-gatherer societies, where your property right is if you're using something, it's yours. If you're not using it, it's not yours. And you're not allowed to break anything because it's not really yours. And that concept and how it connected to the lending library and our experience of the library, when I think this is important when we're talking about the vision of socialism, because I don't think we can do this without actually convincing people. I don't think you can create a pro-social society at the barrel of a gun. It's a contradiction. So we have to convince people. So one of the ways that we can convince people is by connecting to their existing experience of the world.
Yes.
And I think the people that we want on our side fucking love the library. And it just so happens that it also contains a property relationship, a relationship around property that has almost no other institutionalized form under capitalism. So we do this sort of library lending with our friends all the time. There's the last slice of pizza, you let your friend have it. You're not going to have some sort of capitalist competition for it. There's all sorts of little, David Graeber in his book Debt talks about this as interpersonal communism, which is
or baseline communism, right?
It's everywhere. And then the library is this institutional form of it we're already familiar with. And library socialism says we shouldn't live in a marketplace. We should live in a library. And I think it's a vision that people should be able to get on board with.
And can it be expanded in all kinds of ways? Because it can be a network of different usage items. So for instance, one of the things I've always loved about antique stores and thrift stores is when I go into an antique store or I go to buy used clothing, it's already been used, it's being recycled. I'm not putting more carbon pressure on the earth when I get this lamp from this antique store or when I get this clothing at a thrift store. That's the same kind of model that could then turn into a library engagement of reciprocity and exchange, where we're not putting this further pressure on the earth just to have something quote unquote new.
No, it's an uncomfortable thing for people to recognize that when you buy something new, you're not just buying something, you're actually commissioning it to be constructed from raw materials.
You're participating in the Earth's annihilation.
Yeah, and so that's uncomfortable because no one wants to annihilate the Earth, but we need things to participate. And I think there's this contrast between fully automated luxury communism and this sort of degrowth perspective that we're talking about here. But the degrowth perspective is actually just a scientific way of describing the reality on Earth in that context. But fully automated luxury communism is a beautiful vision. And the people who advocate for it make some compelling points. Like if you go to your average person and you say, we're going to build a perfect society, we're going to take everything you like from you to get there, then they're going to be like, no. When you talk about something as primary as coming for the things that people value,
forced collectivization drives,
they're going to be pretty reactive to that premise. And if you have a culture that is all based around justifying forced scarcity on people in a planet that we know scientifically is capable of providing abundance, I think that's a strategic mistake.
It's horrible.
And I think what library socialism can do is square the circle on these two dynamics and say, we can produce an abundant post-scarcity society that provides for everyone and decrease our impact on the planet at the same time.
It's also an engagement of prefigurative politics because you could have a network of a small number of libraries that are doing this in the city. You engage with it, you experience fun, play, and human connection. And you're like, shit, I don't have to do the things I used to do because there's this other thing going on in my town that I really like. And maybe buying the new thing isn't so cool anymore because I'm starting to realize that I'm hurting people and hurting things.
I think you're exactly right that the object of change is one of convincing and not having to convince people of some contradictory mode of existing. And this is why an idea using a familiar existing proto-socialist institutional form that people are already widely familiar with helps to do that and makes it easier for people to envision. And I appreciate the way that you opened one of the conversations about this. I think it was the usufruct episode talking about shopping and the experience of shopping and thinking about a vision of a library socialist world. It helps to imagine the similar kind of experiences that you would still be able to have of going to places to sort through things and make choices and have those things and benefit from those things, but then not have the burden of finding a place to store it when I'm done with it or finding a way to get rid of it. So the vision that one can arrive at without much extra work, without a whole lot of extra cognitive signaling, you say library and socialism together, all of a sudden you can see that it isn't a huge leap. There's going to be some very big shifts that we got to make, like not owning cars all individually and not fucking driving everywhere and not designing the entire fucking city around the space for vehicles and obvious shit like that. But the way that we interact with goods and services largely not being something totally alien.
And on the front of like the shopping malls and the shopping experience thing, I know a lot of people who like shopping. I actually kind of like shopping too. If I want to get something, I can go get it. It's a little mall experience and stuff. And we sort of look down on that experience as consumerism and personalize it and say that, oh, wanting to get the things that you desire is wrong instead of looking at an institutional framework. And so it's like, how much of it can we retain while changing the back? Like, can we change what's in the engine while keeping the user experience similar?
Yes.
Because I don't know anybody who's like, my favorite part of going to the mall is having less money.
Right.
And most people talk about the idea of window shopping, right? Like the pleasure of looking and gazing, that there is beauty in man-made objects, but that we have to do an institutional flip. On what we have. So it's the mode and the pleasure of shopping can be beautiful, a form of engagement in art and experience that heightens our senses, but doesn't do the institutional damage on the planet that consumption does currently under this privatized system of hoarding. And so I think there's a right and a means to participate in consumption because of a shared urban space and gatherings, but that we have to do it in a way that's copacetic with a sustainable Earth.
There's also a dominant mode of consumption of certain types of things currently that is a good signpost for what this would look like. Because if we think about intellectual property and the just dumbfoundingly idiotic amount of work and labor and rulemaking and violence that goes into preventing the thing that is so much easier.
All these walls.
why not make it just freely accessible? And in terms of anticipating the shift, it's hard to think through these things in real time when we talk about big social change, because you'll get a lot of wrong-headed capitalist premise-based techno-utopian bullshit. Like, we're never going to use books again because it's just going to be on the computer. Like, fuck off.
That sort of premise just doesn't understand what it's like to be a person. But sorry, go on.
Exactly. But just how we consume music and movies, the way that we no longer go to the video store. But why do we have 17 different services that you have to pay separate subscriptions to?
Streaming palooza.
Why not? The choice there should be not between Apple TV and Netflix and Disney Plus and HBO Max or whatever the fuck it is. It should be just, well, what user interface do I like? What design do I like? And it should all be accessible.
Mm-hmm. It was sort of my pathway into radical politics, was the realization that there was legal structures keeping people from having positive experiences in their lives. So as like a 15-year-old, I didn't have any money. I didn't have a job. The only job I had, I worked 2 days at a restaurant. They told me, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. And I told them, go fuck yourself. I'm never, ever going to do this shit again. So I wanted to listen to music, though.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have to like go clean the back room of some guy's business for him in order to listen to music. Like, it's a weird premise. So that was sort of like the start of the snowball rolling down the hill that has led me to a anarchist, communist sort of perspective. So on one hand, I want to say, like, okay, if we just stopped putting all this money into the copyright industry to try to protect, to generate DRM, to like do these lawsuits or whatever, even if we just did that and just let people sort of freely do what they want, we would have the greatest collection, the largest library in the history of humankind, the most knowledge in one place, and with the technological capacity for people to go through that knowledge at rates that they hadn't before. And if you're talking about stuff like programs, imagine unlocking the potential of your computer by saying there's no limit to the programs you can run on it. Mm-hmm. If a program exists, you can have it. Well, then your computers went from something that's very powerful to something that's insanely powerful. And then if you take that a step further and say, okay, we're not just going to stop doing the idiotic thing that's making this all worse. We're actually going to put those exact resources into the opposite. Instead of copyright lawyers, we're going to hire people to find more stuff to add to the library. We're going to hire people to increase the amount of information in this space, to help be like librarians, helping people find what they need. Yeah. We have this current level, this degraded level of internet libraries. Then if you just stop pointing guns at people, you're going to get a much better library. And then if you not only stop pointing guns at people, but you help them to understand things better, you can create a level of like information library processing that is beyond even the conceptions of utopians. Mm-hmm. And we have this technological and financial potential to do this immediately. Yep. And so I see it as, now there's a lot of like horrific crimes against humanity that are systemic, but the denial of information and experience and joy to people through these things really, really pissed me off and turned me into an anti-capitalist eventually.
There's all this money, huge amounts of money and shitty jobs, bullshit jobs, to borrow the David Graeber expression, that's used to create these digital walls, these digital barriers to police the free movement of ideas on the internet, much like the free movement of people on geographic spaces. And all of these walls add up to a pretty shitty world. And so when we create a post-scarcity society, all we're talking about really is a world of shared plenty. That we have all the resources we need, and we just have shitty-ass, punitive, carceral state enforcements of needs that could be met really quickly. For instance, example that in America, we throw out 40 to 50% of all food in the United States, but we have people during COVID lining up in cars to get food. And so it's actually this shitty-ass carceral state model of putting up IP walls, of putting up walls on necessary goods like the right to food, shelter, and healthcare and education should be the kinds of ways in which we create a framework of shared consensus. And we are able to win that war when we say, well, this is how we're going to arrive at that through library socialism.
That gets right to one of the core principles that you're drawing on to articulate the ideas of library socialism, as you mentioned before, usufruct as an alternative mode of property relations between people in society. So instead of the current mode of the right to abuse this, what's more important than anything else, I have the right to destroy it. which is what we do to all useful things for people, like throwing out 40% of the food.
I think I first got hip to how weird that was when I heard a libertarian guy say that you have the right to kill your dog because it's yours. I was like, what the fuck? And then I got the wheels turning about how destroying your own property is actually weird.
Yeah.
Right libertarians just like, fuck you, I got mine. It's the most childish thing I've ever heard.
I found out recently, actually, the political compass, the four square thing that we think about that goes authoritarian, libertarian, left, right. Yep. The original version in the 60s was authoritarian to democratic. But the popular version that was promoted by a particular Australian guy is authoritarian to libertarian. And I really think that change of label turned a lot of people a little less informed than they needed to be.
Also, the co-option of the term libertarius, the French expression, was anarchism, and it got co-opted by the right wing as well as the Montpellier Society. It's really despoiled the term libertarian. But definitely, I think the idea is that a left libertarian, a social libertarian view of property is an idea of shared community, that we prosper when we prosper alongside of each other, that a world of cooperation is more efficient, more logical, and sustains and creates the kind of systems of deeper trust that the earth has already been giving to us for a long time, and we've been denigrating.
Both of you touched on this a little bit, but I think the thing that I wanted to highlight that these ideas share is addressing the bullshitification of the world. That exactly if we turn that energy, that potential that is currently and has for centuries been pointed at reinforcing systems of hierarchy, of domination, of oppression, of building walls and gates and keeping other people out, if that energy can be turned around towards productive, complementary, cooperative aims, holy fucking shit. It's not just that we can reduce harm. The way that the world is organized is in such stark contrast to basic human dignity. It's a nonstop parade of harm. It's just a harm hurricane all the time, constantly. So it's hard to sort of sift through the winds of the hurricane to see like, oh, we could do this differently. So there wouldn't be this hurricane in the first place. Right? A big part of this is about just stopping a lot of this bullshit. The Golden Square as not only drawing upon a long-held common ethic and the socialist ethic and a long shared understanding of rights and responsibilities, but to name the material things in a concrete way, food, shelter, healthcare, education, also cuts out the bullshit. This is the objective. Everybody gets those things.
Yeah.
What do we do together? That's what we do together. We make food, shelter, healthcare, and education for each other as the starting point, as the basis for dignity and the way that we get free.
And I think that it's an extension of doing to others as you do unto yourself. And so what would that look like? Well, I have 2 children. I want them to have food, shelter, healthcare, and education. I'm a dick and an asshole if I don't want someone else's kids to have those things too. So it prioritizes what I think are human rights that are decommodified. And it also makes us question the jobs that currently exist that are bullshit, that are hurting people, that are creating walls, that are blocking people for their full liberation and emancipation as human beings. And when we think of the Golden Square, work, fucking tree, work. You know, we don't point at an organism and tell them to work. We just assume that we're naturally productive beings. We are naturally productive and creative beings, but we can't do that well if we don't have these 4 things. And by scoping out a new social contract and new human rights around that, then we can prioritize the kinds of jobs that we actually want, especially when in concert with the Green New Deal. Because what's good with the Green New Deal is library socialism actually gets paid for. We can actually start building civic institutions. And one of the things that I would like to talk about too is what parallel civic structure and institutions should we create to actually build those things, not only decommodify the Golden Square, but also to build civic institutions where we have all these kinds of zones, networks of library socialism in the city that become the dominant part of participation and community belonging. And one of the things that I think is crucial is very much from Jackson, Mississippi, what's called Cooperation Jackson. They have a full social ecology model. And I think the basis of that starts with a community land trust. I'm doing that work in the Inland Empire in Riverside County, San Bernardino County in Southern California. I'm part of a group of co-conspirators to actually create a community land trust that will decommodify land to make housing a human right, but also build in commercial components that would then take on the space of library socialism. So we would have a gaming building where people could play games together. You could have a community movie theater. So all these movie theaters are dying because of COVID. We'll take them fucking over and turn it into library socialism and build the kinds of networks we want. And so I think the community land trust idea might be a mode of building library socialism. I'm curious what you think about that.
Building dual power.
Dual power, absolutely. Because it creates long-term civic engagement. We're not in Rojava where we have the complete annihilation of property because we're in a death-based war. We have highly privatized cities that are highly commodified, and we have to start chipping away at that commodification. And I think a community land trust that's along a social ecological model, building low carbon neutral housing, and at the same time building commercial real estate as community library socialist networks. And I think that is a really good way of building this kind of parallel social structure that builds long-term democracy outside of a kind of electoral politics manifestation, which I think on your show you've talked about as part of the mix, but not the main mix.
First of all, I want to say, I'm really glad to hear talk about decommodification in specific, because the process of decommodification, I've had a hard time having people respond to describing what that would look like, but it's an important piece of the sort of prefigurative whole. And to tie a few things together, now, Jesse mentioned earlier about how the existence of libraries helps be an intuition pump. People have this experience. Yep. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, if you do something like Cooperation Jackson or do something like this proposal that you're having, it creates a space where people can again have the experience where then they have enough context to think about these things from a place of experience. Mm-hmm. And so in the Golden Square model, I think this would probably fit most under education, but I think one of the most important parts of education and this whole mix is revolutionary education, which is a building of political consciousness. Murray Bookchin called it Paideia. Mm-hmm. Karl Marx called it the revolutionary subject, turning people into revolutionary subjects through experience. And so there's been this, debate on the left about means and ends and prefiguration and stuff like that. But I really think it's sort of a done debate, because there's no way to do anything except prefigure if you live in a society that you can't control everything. You live in a society where you've got a global planet, you can't control everything. You're always making the new in the shell of the old, even if you're taking the most hardline authoritarian leftist perspective. So as far as I'm concerned, it's really a finished conclusion that we've come to. Yes. And if you want any of these tactics to work, there's no option. There's no other game in town except listening to people, working together, and then building what you can against the backdrop of what already is. Absolutely. And if you look at natural history, again, this is an evolutionary perspective. Look at the extinction of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs didn't go extinct because all of the mammals rose up against their oppressors, and they had this theory of change, and then they took over the biosphere. So mammals evolved alongside the tyrannical lizards. Our ancient ancestors, our grandparents, going back tens of millions of years, were rodents. And they evolved the basics of the way that we relate to each other socially in the context of very, very simple beings, very, very simple compared to us. But by building up this capacity on the margins of a biosphere that they were not dominant in, the mammalian tools that have led us to create planes, buildings, and science fiction. You don't find horses writing science fiction. It's humans. What led to us writing science fiction was a process where things were displaced, where things exist alongside each other, random things happen. So as far as I see it, capitalism, hierarchism, and stuff like that, it's probably going to be taken out by a meteor and not all the mice getting together. But the mice need to be ready. The mice need to be together because we need to survive the meteor. I don't know. This is an imperfect metaphor, and I haven't thought of all the details of the way that works. Yeah. But if you look at the way that nature develops, things don't get replaced in Thunderbolt. Yeah. Things exist alongside each other.
We can chip away at things, but they're going to have to exist within the shell of the current system. And any attempt at making change will require working on the margins, doing what's called escaping capitalism to basically build prefigurative models. And this is where I think something like a community land trust is really crucial, because as we decommodify land, we can start to decommodify all kinds of social relations. As Chuck Willambe said, we have to free the land to free ourselves. And so I think that's kind of the node at where I think library socialism can be built in an active, concrete sense, is through the decommodification of land. And that will require popular assemblies, community participation, all kinds of zones of integration on the municipal level, on the civic level, on the grassroots level. And so that's an area where we can start to see it, because we're not going to get out of capitalism without doing some prefiguration. And I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, the whole game needs to be focused on decommodification.
Mm-hmm.
Decommodification gets at the heart of this trap that we're in, this cult of capitalism that is heading us towards extinction, that the way out of that is actively working to decommodify life.
Yeah, we just know you're not going to create human rights unless there's some process of decommodification. There is no existing model of universal healthcare on the planet that has created the rights for healthcare if it didn't involve some level of decommodification. Because commodification is actually how we got here, is how we got this huge irregularities, inequalities, and scarcity logics that just dominate our horizon. And so in many cases, we have to imagine that to get food, shelter, healthcare, and education as part of the golden square, it must undergo a chipping away of this commodified world. And I think that's the horizon, because the full decommodification would be something like library socialism, where you can walk in and out to get shoes or a vest or camping equipment or get a good book or maybe get some toys for your son because Legos are full of fucking plastic, that's oil-based, and we're going to have to start recycling these things. So that decommodification is definitely central. And the prefigurative mode is also central.
And more democracy.
Yeah.
One, I want to just acknowledge a like-mindedness with what you've called sweetie pie approach.
I love that phrase.
Of
Sweetie
taking
pie.
people at their word, acknowledging that nobody's read all the books. Nobody's made all of the blueprints. Nobody knows fucking everything. If somebody can answer me how many birds are in flight at this moment, then maybe we'll have a discussion about how much you know. But other than that...
At least 10.
Yeah, at least 10.
It's kind of like the Jeremy Corbyn thing. Like, as an MP before he rose to some kind of potential power, he would talk to anyone who's very good in one-on-one. He said, like, every person you meet knows something you don't. And if you work on that baseline, that your life could be enriched by engaging in someone in a non-authoritarian, cooperative manner, your life will be more enriched from that conversation. We don't think that we have all the ideas, and that the greater utopian horizon will be constructed through these deliberative conversations of dreamscaping.
Mm-hmm.
And actually engaging democratically with each other, which is something we actually almost never do.
You don't even know how to do it.
Or not allowed to do.
Actually practicing democracy, having a say in how your world, the world that you are a participant in, is shaped. I don't think I've ever actually experienced that.
Mm. On the subject of commodification, though, there's something, no, this isn't a 100% finished idea. It's stuff that I'm sort of thinking through, but I'm excited to share it. So I think library socialism takes an approach to the question of the state that's sort of a semi-state approach, similar to the way that Echelon talks about, but in different ways. So libraries are often state-funded, and the library socialist position is, that's good. Give libraries some more fucking money.
Yeah.
And when it comes to decommodification, now, like the three of us, we bought a piece of land. We're like, this is decommodified land. This is decommodified house. And we just claim that. That's one thing. That's prefiguration. That's good. It's a step. But at the end of the day, the land is a commodity under capitalism. The things that you produce are commodities under capitalism.
It's not up to us.
Exactly. So even if we create a social space where we can pull outside of capitalism and do this decommodified stuff, we're actually still technically ignoring that they're commodities, which still better, but they're still commodities. So if you want to actually decommodify things, similarly to the way that we like it when the state funds libraries, in order to decommodify land, you need to zone it differently under the law. And in order to decommodify property, you need to treat it differently and make it illegal to buy or sell. That is what institutional decommodification looks like. And if you mix a prefigurative strategy with a willingness to have institutions back you up and back up the people power, back up the dual power, back up these grassroots institutions, and then say, okay, well, we're going to make demands of the formal institutions to use their power under this system to make what we do law. One of the ways I've thought about this is a decommodified urban food tower. It's a little fanciful utopian idea where you're building food in a food tower greenhouse thing. Probably a state taxation organ would be in the best position to fund, build something like that, hire staff, all that stuff to make towers that produce food in cities. But then you could also make it the law that it's illegal to buy or sell those vegetables. It's illegal to buy or sell that food. That food must be given away by the structure of the organization, by the terms of reference, and by the law of the land. So that's what decommodification looks like. And there's a lot of complex things that come out of this organic, flowing, back and forth process, that the shape of a real, actual move that's very seriously grounded in reality towards a much better society would look like. I can imagine lots of debates around this and, oh, you're using money for this or that or whatever.
Yeah.
But we live in this world and we have no option about that.
Yeah.
So how can we make the best of it? And Oshalon deals with states in an interesting way. He says the state might exist for a long time. We don't care. It's not democratic. We are, and we'll challenge the state, but agnostic on how long it takes to fade away or how. That sort of space of just admitting that you don't know is so powerful.
Yeah.
And the whole history of the left has been based on us all pointing fingers at each other and pretending
being
we know.
100% certain about things. That's the Marxist line, is go back to the text and worship it, and that's the certainty.
Yeah.
But if we come to a place of vulnerability as a broader radical left, revolutionary left, that we don't know everything, and that let's be multi-tendency in terms of our arrangements, we can get something much better out of that arrangement.
It's also part of the implications of the golden square as a proposal, but what it implies is the full role of the state would be to ensure the provision of the golden square, of meeting basic needs, full stop, which necessarily means all of the other things that it's doing currently need to go away. It means no fucking military. It means this is the project of coming together. Like, why else would we create some kind of structure to keep track of what we're all doing together, unless it's to make sure that we're all at least have dignity? So as a baseline
Of a dignified life.
Right. It's also a test of legitimacy for any state structure is it providing in a decommodified way? Like you said, one mode within the structures of the state currently would be by law. So is the state making it illegal to collect rents? Are the rules of the game of the state making it illegal to make healthcare service a commodity? Is it making it illegal to charge tuition and fees for school? It provides a complete practical and moral container for the objective of organizing together as a society.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the golden square, it's a complete aspect of something. It's necessary, but it's also not sufficient. It's totally
Absolutely.
possible that you have a government that provides housing, food, shelter, and education to everyone, but also surveils them 24/7, gives them no democratic rights, et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really, really good ruler stick in the way that you're talking about it, being like, are we even meeting the basics here?
Yes.
It's not the be-all, end-all. It's a piece of the whole frame, and it's a way of seeing one aspect of it, right?
It's the basis of any dignified life. Yeah. It's like bare minimum of the social contract of your city or of the larger state apparatus, if you want to make it. Once again, we work from an anarchist ethics. It's an orientation. It's a toolkit.
Yeah.
And we can work in a dual power manifestation with the state, but say, hey, if you want to exist as a state, what are you doing on food, shelter, healthcare, and education? If you're not doing those things, then why do you exist? And it becomes a way of measuring their legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Not presuming any structure or modality necessarily. Like, I just wanted to be free. To be free means these things are not commodities. Mm-hmm. There is no motherfucking cost of living.
Abolish the motherfucking cost of living.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what it'd be if not cost. The material, the social expense, I can't even think of a non-capitalist metaphor for when you get rid of the cost of living, and it's like the X of living. It's like it's so weird, actually, just thinking about that cost of living. That's pretty new too, right?
How about I just have an experience of life?
It's weird to think that when you wake up in the morning, you're just sort of like slowly incurring rent debt. And if you haven't got money in the bank account,
it's a sad little fucking video game is what it is. It's like you got a clock, and that clock is connected to not just your life and how long you live, but like all these material things you have to collect, like Pokemon characters.
With the growing mainstream embrace of socialism as an alternative, more often than in decades past, you see the call for acknowledging some of these things as human rights. So the call for Medicare for all and the call for canceling student debt and these sorts of things. We see people start to say...
rights framework.
We see this a lot of the time too, that people say 2 or 3 of these things. Typically, it'll be housing, healthcare, and education. Everybody has a right to housing. Everybody has a right to healthcare. Everybody has a right to education as that sort of limit of it. But beyond that, beyond a sort of narrow use of the terms, when I talk about it, I mean in an expansive way. So when I talk about food, I mean, yes, obviously, clean water, clean air, And when I say shelter, I mean the means to protect. We're talking about healthcare, the means to heal. Talk about education, it's the means to grow. So not a narrow conception of existing forms of those things, but also that conditions are important. Like you said, it could be some fascist state even that could provide these things in a bare minimum kind of way. If you think of being housed in a prison as one mode of providing these things.
Literal prisons have a very, very weak version of the golden square in them.
Right. Exactly. So that's why.
Well, that's why people in the past have stolen food because they needed health care. So
conditions are important, that they're unconditional, universal, and lifelong.
Cradle to grave.
Built into this idea too is the notion that these things aren't just limited. It's not like, for some part of your lifetime, education especially. Like, what kind of idiotic way to design a system of education that only when you're like 18 to 22, you take one course on a thing and you take some test to spit out some trivia? What the fuck?
Yeah.
That is just stupid.
Yeah, why is education end at a certain age? Like, you can no longer be curious as a human or learn new things.
Yeah.
This idea of like an ever-growing organism, ever-reaching, is something that should be manifold in the educational institution. It's something that's cradle to grave.
Yeah.
Especially stopping at an age that's sort of like notorious for not being a wise age. Like, we're going to stop learning at exactly the time when people typically make their silliest mistakes.
We know that the prefrontal cortex doesn't actually start to finish off until 22, 25. So you may not want to go to school at that age, but you'd be perfect at 35 or 40 in your life. Yeah. But you can't go because you won't fit in because you're not a certain manufacturing date. And that's a cruel way of designing education, is that it's based on some type of manufacturing date as a human being.
Oh, yeah. The thought that people who actually really, truly desire to learn things have to go hang out with a bunch of 20-year-olds who want to get drunk because their parents made them go at that time. It's like, yeah, it's not the best.
It's a kind of a carceral state version of education.
And this is part of evidence of not being free that I think about almost every single day, because I'm working all the time to figure things out. I'm working in the space of ideas and I don't fucking know shit. So what am I going to do? There's something I don't know. I want to ask somebody. I have an impulse. I want to ask somebody and have a conversation about a thing and let's have a discussion, because I know that's the quickest, best way for me to open the door to learn about something. For my dollar, the human search engine is the most enjoyable user interface for the search engine.
That's a user interface that our ancient mammalian mice ancestors were using a very primitive version of. So the idea that you want to ask questions to another person and have it makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of people are in that position. Like, there's all these debates around like reading theory and stuff. And it's like, theory is a record of conversations. It can be good or it can be not good, like any idea, but conversations are primary. Yeah. So it bothers me when people read theory as a way to avoid conversations, because it's like putting the cart before the horse, or it's like putting the cart there without the horse.
Yeah, that edict should be have conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have a Marxist tell me, well, shut up and go read more theory and come back to me. Like, I'm not going to do the emotional labor. No, you're a socialist. Do the fucking emotional labor. It's called talking to people.
Well, I had the experience with that too, where I, early on in my understanding of Marxism, had some serious misunderstandings that were caused by situations like that, where someone explained something poorly. They told me to go read it myself. And then I did go read it myself, but I didn't have the context required to see what people even saw in it. Mm-hmm. And a conversation would have went a long way. And I just briefly, to defend Marxists in general, I know so many brilliant Marxists. And I think the heart of Marxism is totally based around pushing for new frontiers and figuring out resynthesizing and stuff like that. But I think it's also true when we look at the sort of historical development of Marxism, and especially the way that it's got a relationship with power structures. There are things in the developmental trajectory of Marxism that are hard to escape from along those lines, and it comes from things like being named after a guy instead of an idea.
Exactly.
And it comes from things like having a state ideology be a form of Marxism.
And it's economist's viewpoint on hierarchy. It's not just that class reductionism. It's the fact that you have to tack stuff on top of it because you didn't deal with all these other hierarchies.
But what I'm going to say is that, so I have that impulse, right, to search the human search engine for things that I'm curious about every day. But where do I go to do that? You've got debt, you've got to pay. I've got debt, I've got to pay. We're all running around.
We're racking up debt this very moment.
Racking up debt all the time. So it's very rare to have that opportunity.
We're on that hamster wheel all the time to get the golden square. So we're constantly trying to just meet our everyday needs. And so we can't actually thrive. We're just trying to survive.
We're not really even on the hamster wheel for the golden square, because typically, especially in places like the US, healthcare and education aren't even the things. It's just to like put food on the table. To put food on the table. That's what people are on the hamster wheel for all the time.
When someone says, okay, we don't have enough resources on the planet to give people food, shelter, healthcare, and education, we say, well, look, we can use these civic institutions like the Library Socialism to meet those needs through that apparatus and set of institutions that involve deep democracy, direct democracy, mass participation, mutual aid, and that we can actually meet all of those global needs on the planet through a library socialism as a method.
We can actually provide more with less.
Yes.
No, that's totally true. And it's wild to think that you could use less and get more in the end, but that's just what sharing does. It's a social material dynamic. One thing that comes to mind about the golden square is there's this social ecological idea, this Bookchin idea that I only really wrap my head around recently that I think this relates to. And apparently it's based on, there's some version of it that was promoted by Trotsky. Bookchin, when he was younger, he was a Trotskyist, and then he sort of developed it into social ecology. And it's the concept of a minimum program, a transitionary program, and a maximum program. What this is intended to be is a way of thinking about political objectives and political change in the world where you don't lose any of the little details that are required to talk about a revolutionary change. So the minimum program is something like cops stop killing innocent people.
Yeah.
You know, it's not utopian.
No.
It's just stopping doing something dystopian. And similarly, Medicare for all. It's a minimum program idea because you're just really doing the basics at that point. You're stopping doing the horrible thing.
Yeah.
And the maximum program is the sort of perfect utopian outcome of library socialism, the maximum amount of freedom that we can imagine. And in that space, you know, we're sort of supposed to be as utopian as possible. We're supposed to be infinitely demanding and never take anything as enough. Never say that, you know, Medicare for all is enough. Mm-hmm. Nothing is enough. There's always going to be new frontiers within that context. And as we get closer to it, we're going to have even more imaginative ideas of where we could even go further.
That's what Ursula K. Le Guin gets at, I think, with her classic and masterful novel, The Dispossessed, is that utopias can be and should be dynamic, ever-evolving, ever-perfecting, and that there is what Margaret Atwood calls the ustopia inside of the utopia, that they're intermixed, and that there's going to be some dystopian elements in the utopia you might live in, but that we should still always demand the impossible because we might have to do the unthinkable with climate change.
Mm-hmm. And so the golden square and its full realization strikes me as something that would be sort of part of the middle step, the transitionary program, because what you're describing is what are the preconditions of freedom in a meaningful sense? And how can we give people free, thriving choice in their lives? And so there's different orders that this could come in and stuff like that. But the transitional program is basically the idea that these are changes that aren't just like incidental stopping of horrific things. They're not just things that would be nice or would be better, but they're things that create space for human freedom. And there's a little bit of fluctuation between the minimum program and the transitionary program, because the transitionary program is really when you do a whole bunch of it and create a new stable, a new normal, a new basic, a new realm of freedom.
And it will feel revolutionary when it happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Revolution V1.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, can you imagine the Earth where everyone has the human rights to food, shelter, healthcare, and education? That has never existed on the entire planet. Yeah. Period. Ever.
I'm going to be honest.
And so that will feel revolutionary in itself.
I can't imagine what that feels like. I really can't.
It's amazing. But it's still not enough. We deserve all.
The really wild thing is that we're in an age right now where the potential for this happening is at a level that it's never been before. Our technological capacity, our networking capacity, the amount of knowledge going on, it goes on and on, all these different reasons that we live in a qualitatively different time in history than ever before. And so even though I'm very utopian, I spent a lot of time thinking about how things could be, I think this might be the first time I've ever thought about how it would feel to succeed in the transitional program, and also connecting that with my knowledge that because of the conditions we're in society, it's something we can achieve in our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And that there's a chance that we're all going to be gray hairs in 30 years or, you know, whatever amount of time it is. And you're going to we're going to feel this, and the people listening are going to feel this, and the people who are participating in the project of Bernie Sanders or whatever leftist sort of stuff is happening around, the people participating in that have the opportunity to have that feeling before they die, that we pulled it off. And I can't, it's such an exciting thought to think of the
shifting of the Overton window is real. It has a consequence.
It's something that, now we're not going to perfect society before we wrap up our time on this planet, but we could cross the threshold where we can say in a really real way and really feel it in our hearts, we fucking did it.
Yeah. I always say that the golden square is the bare minimum. Right now, we're trapped in a pyramid scheme. That's these compounding systems of hierarchy.
Capitalism, celebrity, and religion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that we're aiming for the utopian sphere. We have a utopian horizon as the thing that we're aiming at ultimately. But the first step, the minimum step, the bare minimum, like be decent. Let's acknowledge that we're fellow human beings living together on this planet and that we each deserve dignity is the golden square. Is we don't make the material means to have freedom traps to cage people in, which is what they always have been. So the program too, what I think is eminently achievable, is that most of these things are trapped by very thinly veiled myths that are quickly eroding, that things like education being free is totally doable.
Easy. We could have spent it with the stimulus funds already.
It's just digits on screen. We just get those digits out of the way and we can start to experience freedom. And I think as a leverage point out of capitalism, I agree it's hard to even imagine like what kind of unleashing of potentiality that will bring forth. Because holy fucking shit, I don't have to do some totally useless bullshit job just to put food on the table. Everything fucking changes. Everything fucking changes.
Mm-hmm. For the transitional program, when we're thinking about what is the threshold that includes, like you said, the golden square as part of that bare minimum of what we owe each other, I think what I would add to the transitional program on top of that is institutions of freedom. Mm-hmm. So institutions of freedom could be like the community organizations that Matthew was talking about before. Mm-hmm. It could be things like decommodified space, tool libraries, and so on. The online library aspect to it and stuff is like when we achieve a sufficient combination of these things at once. Like you said, Jesse, you're talking about a different world in a fundamental way that is so fundamentally different that the only thing I can predict about it is that like we're going to get to see and know each other for the first time.
Exactly.
And it brings up that notion of third nature from Murray Bookchin, right? Like that aspirational model where the reharmonization with technology and human footprint to first nature starts to meet and congeal in this loving embrace. And that's tremendously exciting. It gets me up in the morning.
And for me, that's what gets to the heart of how I see there being such a complementary relationship between the notion of this, both a material and ethical demand of the golden square, along with a mode of organizing through institutions like the library, of that modality as being the necessary sort of parts of how this will arrive, that how we arrive and experience a world wherein we no longer have a quote unquote cost of living would be through the combination of these things.
Just to bring it back to Marx for all of our Marxist friends in the audience.
Yes.
You know, when he talks about the revolutionary subject, he's not saying that people are in certain positions in society and it means that they're going to be able to therefore inherently overthrow capitalism in a teleological way. All these arguments within Marxism were actually resolved decades ago. They just show up because people start talking before they've spoken to elders about this sort of stuff. But what he was actually talking about, and I think this is a profound idea that we can take into any practice, whether or not we look to the legacy of Marx, which is what makes the proletarians the revolutionary subject to him is the process of revolutionary subjectivity being built through revolutionary experience. And what that means to me, and how I think this applies to what we're saying, is we can use prefiguration and stuff to build revolutionary consciousness within the shell of this world. But the end game is a world where everyone's basic needs are met
Yes.
and where everyone's a revolutionary subject and everyone participates in the co-authoring of the future and where it really matters what you say and what you think in a way that no one who lives on Earth has really ever experienced. Because even the people who have disproportionate say in the things that happen are dehumanized by it. There's too much responsibility for Jeff Bezos. His vote should be the same as mine. And if you give him more votes than me, you're opening up a moral travesty for him that he's going to have to face after he dies when he sees God. And I feel bad for the poor guy because I don't want to face down the Lord having done what Jeff Bezos has done. We need to liberate him from that horrific situation. You know, like Oscar Wilde said, the rich people are burdened by their wealth. We should take it away from them. Give them a break.
They're not free. They're not free.
They're not, because they're constantly thinking, oh, how am I going to keep it?
It's like they're trying to collect cats, like the cat lady. They just want to hoard all of their cats into a room and keep breeding them. It's like, no, there's all these other houses that need a goddamn cat. Let go.
So you're saying you're on Team Bezos?
I'm on Team Bezos getting into heaven because we took away all his money.
The objective to arrive at this minimum or transitional program, this next necessary era in a trajectory of evolution towards a utopian sphere, is just about building the global library socialist society we all deserve by just choosing to do the dumbfoundingly obvious, undeniably popular, and unmistakably awesome shit that we know people need and love. That's it. Stop doing the bullshit. Do the good shit.
Yeah, fuck yeah. People like good stuff. It's not like
people, me the weed.
No, I want bad stuff.
I want mediocre life and mediocre food, please.
Sometimes leftists sort of act that way a bit, and I don't like to generalize about the left, but it's something you encounter in individuals sometimes, is they talk about normal people as if they're not capable of coming to rational ethical conclusions, as if they don't have the drive to help each other. And just the real strength of anarchism is saying, it doesn't have to be this way. It's like we can question every part of it. Like we're going to hold everything to impossibly high standards. It's the way to go.
It's returning to that childhood sense of wonder and expectation that the world is open for me and I'm open to it, as so long as I listen and communicate equally with others.
All right. Well, I had a blast listening and communicating equally with the both of you this afternoon.
Thanks for joining us, Shawn. We love your podcast. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, no, it was a pleasure talking with you all. And I didn't mention it before, I do a podcast. You mentioned it, Seriously Wrong. We talk about this stuff and other stuff. We do comedy sketches and stuff. I think it's pretty good, worth checking out.
We like it too. Yeah.
It's good.
Good stuff. Not mediocre. Nothing mediocre in this place. That's Trump Plaza. That's not us.
We don't have a Patreon, so you can donate to Aaron and Shawn's.
That's great. And you want to say that you say that at the end of your episodes all the time? That's amazing.
It's good. Okay. Thanks.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah, no worries.